The situation in the Bakhmut direction in Ukraine's east is very complex and dynamic. After the failure to cut Ukrainians off from the south of Ivanivsky village, Russians decided to divert their focus to the north of the village. Russians made incremental gains in this area, enabling them to break the stalemate and maintain their momentum in and around the village. The hill to the northwest of Ivanivsky gave Ukrainians a tactical advantage, enabling them to strike Russians who were trying to advance in the lowlands through the village. For this reason, Russians constantly shelled the hill with artillery and bombed it with aviation. Their aim was to establish a foothold on the hills, then entrench and expand their control. After that, Russians would inevitably try to establish fire control over the road to the village, force Ukrainians out, and cut off major supply lines. Once Ukrainian defenses to the south of the village are undermined, the Russian plan is to finish the operation by advancing from the hills to try to take Klishivka into a pocket. After the Russians finished conducting their artillery preparation and suppressing the Ukrainian fire, they launched a powerful attack with infantry and armored vehicles. Geolocated footage shows that, in the aftermath of heavy clashes, Russians established control of part of the hill that is facing the village. Meanwhile, Ukrainians maintained some positions to the west of the hill, hoping to launch counterattacks and regain the lost positions. After the capture of a tactically important hill, Russians could advance while facing much softer Ukrainian resistance in the village itself. For this reason, Russians launched extensive preparations with very destructive TOS thermobaric artillery systems to pummel Ukrainian positions and amplified the destruction with drone strikes. After that, Russians launched one wave of assaults into the village after another. Ukrainian fighters report that the situation is difficult, but that they are holding on and knocking out Russian armored vehicles. Based on footage from the village, we can see that the village is mostly destroyed as a result of heavy bombings over the past months. Because of the lack of proper infrastructure for firing positions and sleeping quarters, neither Russians nor Ukrainians can exercise proper control over these ruins with troops on the ground. For this reason, every Russian assault into the village consists of mostly armored vehicles, in hopes of overwhelming Ukrainians with their sheer firepower and numbers, which leads to heavy losses for the Russians due to lack of infantry support. However, Ukrainian fighters report that supply lines to the village are now also placed in danger because of the Russian control of the tactical elevation from which they use anti-tank guided missiles to strike Ukrainian vehicles moving along the road. To counter this, Ukrainians launched FPV drone strikes at Russian positions on the hill. Generally, the roads in this direction are very dangerous not only because of the Russian anti-tank fire, but also because of the damage to other vital roads like the one to Chasiv Yar, and here the situation is very intense but much less difficult. Russians, as seen before, have resorted to scorched earth tactics to demolish any infrastructure that can be used by Ukrainians as fortifications, firing positions, shelters, or sleeping quarters. In Chasiv Yar, the extensive daily bombings with glide bombs that carry hundreds of kilograms of explosives forced the Ukrainians to no longer use the town as a point of troops rotation and treatment of wounded, and instead have to use nearby towns. Ukrainian fighters report that roads to the town itself are so damaged by bombings to the point they are no longer usable. However, this comes off as a double-edged sword for the Russians. Although they inflict hard blows on Ukrainian logistics, they also cause problems for themselves in advance because they will have nowhere to establish positions if Ukrainians withdraw. For this reason, the Russian bombings only increase the gray zone between the two sides. Despite all this, Ukrainians are tightly holding their positions in front of Chasiv Yar, where they are planning a counterattack on the hill north of Ivanivsky to relieve their forces. The goal of Ukrainian forces here is to delay Russian attacks long enough until defensive lines along the Seversky-Donetsk Canal are ready to finally put the Russian offensive to a halt, so that Ukrainians may regain the initiative and switch the course of fighting in their favor. Meanwhile, Russia is amassing 100,000 troops ahead of a potential summer offensive, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces said on Friday. We do not know Russia's plans to the fullest extent. We only know the data they have and what they are creating. They are creating groups, more than 100,000, Lieutenant General Oleksandr Pavlyuk said on Ukrainian TV. It will not necessarily be an offensive. Perhaps they will use it to replenish their units that are losing their combat capability, he said. But there is a possibility that by the beginning of summer, they may have some forces to conduct offensive operations in one of the directions, he added. To prepare for the potential assault, Ukraine has started withdrawing some brigades to restore their combat capability, Pavlyuk continued. The think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, said that Russia appeared to be continuing consistent offensive operations throughout eastern Ukraine in a bid to retain the initiative in the conflict. Russia likely wants to maintain momentum after its successful seizure of Avdiivka in February, Pavlyuk said. Since capturing the city, Russian forces have had some small successes, this week claiming to have taken 2 villages near the city. Pavlyuk noted that Russia was committing its resources in the directions of Avdiivka, Lyman, and Bakhmut, all in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. The Battle of Avdiivka was one of the bloodiest in the war so far, with both sides incurring heavy losses. The UK Ministry of Defense previously said in an intelligence update that Russia was averaging nearly 1,000 casualties per day in Ukraine in February, the highest since the war began. The department said on Thursday that while Russia was continuing to make minor gains, its advances have slowed in recent weeks, likely due to the significant losses its forces suffered in the campaign to take Avdiivka.